Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to talk a little bit about the breaking news from just a few hours ago. For those of you who are unaware, Konami has announced that OTS stores are now going to be able to run sanctioned retro Yu-Gi-Oh! Events. They're referring to it as the Time Wizard, the ability to go back in time, perhaps to, let's say, GOAT format, and actually run a local where presumably you'll be awarded OTS packs for entry and then potentially for winning, allowing stores to not only do GOAT format, but really any format that they so choose. With that, I think there are several things that need to be taken into consideration. And then I also think it's worth talking about what the most likely and the best case scenarios are going forward. Because the moment that you open the door to actually sanctioning retro Yu Gi Oh!, there's quite a few different pathways that could take. There are also some issues with it that I think need to be addressed initially. If this is actually going to work, if these considerations are not addressed, then local tournaments are going to run events that simply just don't work. There's going to be way too much confusion, and people are going to be turned off by retro Yu-Gi-Oh! Very quickly if the considerations that I'm about to identify are not addressed off the bat. So I am super excited about this announcement. I am a little bit fearful, though, that it's going to be approached in the manner that actually causes it to fail as opposed to succeed. I think if the considerations that I'm about to talk about are addressed, there's a lot of potential here. We're talking about, side events at a YCS, if not potentially more. But I'm going to talk all about what I think, the considerations that need to be made, and then the potential pathways, both the most likely reasonable pathways, what I think will actually happen. And then if this is done perfectly, if this is actually done right, what the best case scenarios are. So we're going to start on the left here and talk about what I think are the considerations that need to be made. And if these are not accepted and addressed initially, people are going to have confusion. People are going to go to local tournaments and be very, very frustrated. The first is the reality that Konami has decided to errata cards in really dramatic ways. So, for example, Chaos Emperor Dragon is nowhere close to its original incarnation. And as a result, if we're going back and playing formats where Chaos Emperor Dragon was initially legal, it seems obvious to say this, but it needs to be made. We're playing with old Chaos Emperor Dragon rules. We're playing with the old rules of the errated cards, old Crush Card Virus. We're playing with all of those old ones, Premature Burial, Imperial Order. Even if it makes those cards unfun or overpowered, I can understand why they have been addressed in modern context, why Brain Control, for example, is weaker, why Imperial Order is weaker, but we still can't do that if we're going to go back and play old formats. Retro Yu-Gi-Oh! Needs to be Retro Yu-Gi-Oh! The broken cards, the cards that were overpowered, the cards that were frustrating in 2003, 2004 need to remain as they were, or else we're creating this pseudo old Yu-Gi-Oh! That isn't really committed to the older rules or to the older cards, and that could be a big issue, and that needs to be definitive. If we are going to follow erratas, we need to definitively state day one that erratas that take place, before the format can actually take effect, but anything afterwards we're not going to consider. So, for example, if you want to play, Burning Abyss format, I do recall I wasn't actually playing during Burning Abyss format, but I think Crush Card Virus was legal. It had just been errated. If you're going to go play that format, well, obviously you're going to play in that moment's version of Crush Card Virus. You're not going to play the 2007 version of Crush Card Virus. That makes logical sense. It shouldn't really have to be said, but I think it needs to be said very clearly. That statement needs to be declared so that everyone is on the same page. That's really the first consideration. We don't want to turn people off because they show up to an event, they think they can use Brain Control like it was used in 2007 in the middle of, let's say, T-Hero format or Troop Dupe format. It's just not the same card. Well, that's not fun. The entire format was dominated by 3 Brain Controls. If we're going to play summer of 2007, I want Brain Control to do what it did in the summer of 2007. Seems obvious, but I think it needs to be made. The next consideration is perhaps more important because I don't think it's as obvious and it's more difficult to actually accomplish from the perspective of Konami, and that is we need to have universally accepted rulings that were correct in the midst of the time period to the best of our ability. And there's some gray area here. There are some cards that have gone through a lot of different iterations of rulings. Mind Crush is one that comes to mind. There were events where if you activated Mind Crush, you got to look at your opponent's hand regardless of if they had the card in their hand. The only way you wouldn't is if they discarded the maximum quantity. So, for example, let's just say for the sake of argument, there's no monsters on the field and you call Book of Moon, a card that's ranged from 1 to 3. Well, let's say your opponent discarded 1, but it's at 3. You get to look at their hand. There are other times, though, that exact scenario would occur and you don't get to look at their hand. There are some times where you could call a judge over, confirm with the judge that you don't have additional copies of Book of Moon, and your opponent doesn't get to see it, which means Mind Control's power is ranged from always letting you look at your opponent's hand and just being a generically powerful card to you don't get to actually look at their hand and it only be a really niche card that has targeted usage. So the fact that that has such a range requires us to pinpoint when in time Mind Crush has been ruled in one way versus the other to the best of our ability. Sometimes it's honestly event to event where card like that shifted, so it's really hard to necessarily do that. But we should, within reason, try to pinpoint when Mind Crush was ruled certain ways to make it so that everyone's on the same page. You don't want someone at a local to flip Mind Crush thinking it does one thing when it does another. In addition to that, there are some erratas that occurred, even mistranslations that occurred if we go really far back into Yu-Gi-Oh! That I think need to be addressed. For example, when Bazoo the Soul Leader and Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer first came out in Labyrinth of Nightmare, you could actually banish, or at that point remove from play, spell and trap cards, which made Bazoo especially powerful, right? You think about, turn one, you play Graceful, you discard a couple spells, summon Bazoo, banish Graceful Charity. It's a pretty powerful card early on in those first couple of turns, right? People are playing things like Jinzo, and you could attack right over a Jinzo on the first or second turn by banishing 3 spells, or a combination of spell and trap plus monster. As a result, it was eventually errated, it was eventually changed, translated properly, and there's this gray area where if we're going to go back that far into Yu-Gi-Oh's history and play one of those formats, are we going to play Bazoo in its mistranslation, or are we going to play Bazoo post the proper translation? That's something that needs to be taken into consideration. It's right there with the errata issue, but it's almost even a ruling issue. Cards like that totally changed in functionality when we fixed the way cards could be removed from play and acknowledge the difference between what Kaiku and Bazoo should be doing versus what it was initially doing. I have here a screenshot of a conversation that I had with another old Yu-Gi-Oh fan, a close individual in the relative area to where I live, who I've had the opportunity to play with in person. He and I have gone back and forth several times through Facebook about old rulings. He's asked me random questions, hey, I know at this point of the format, I think this was ruled this way. I've been going back into, Pojo, I've gone back into Reddit, I've gone back into as many sources that I can find, old metagame coverage, trying to figure out exactly when this ruling changed. So if I'm playing this format, should I do X or Y? You don't want that gray area. We really need to be definitive that if we have a format and we've identified a format, all of those types of gray area things need to be determined ahead of time so that when somebody shows up to the event, they know how Mind Crush works, they know if Bazoo is going to be ruled as it was originally printed, or if we're ruling it the way it was printed 6 months later when it had its errata. So that's really important, is to definitively determine the unique rulings of each format so the players know what to expect. The other big thing there, and this is a screenshot on the right that I have, is when we are doing that, we also need to be clear what point in a format we're talking about, and that's something I'm going to talk about in the next slide, so it's going to sort of transition there. Big card like Royal Oppression saw a massive, massive change in the summer of 2008. It all of a sudden went from a card that you needed to preemptively flip and then keep on the field to a card that you could flip in response to the special summon of something like Dark Arm Dragon or Gyzarus out of the Gladiator Beast deck, and make it so that you could basically 1-for-1 the special summon and then have Royal Oppression on the field, making it no longer a preemptive flip, which meant your opponent actually had to invest in the special summon. Obviously, that's way better. Way better. You don't have to just assume your opponent has Dark Arm. You can actually wait for the Dark Arm, 1-for-1 the Dark Arm, and have Oppression on the field. It's much better that way. Well, if we're going to go back and play the summer of 2008, are we going to play the beginning where Dark Arm Dragon was at its absolute peak with 3 Allure of Darknesses, Defusion? Are we going to play after the emergency ban or before Gladiator Beast Gyzarus was printed? Are we going to play in that small window of time where there was this watered down Dark Arm deck, but not quite Gyzarus? Are we just going to play Nationals? Because if we play Nationals, and then all of a sudden the Royal Oppression topic comes up, or are we going to play after? It's really important to do what I'm going to talk about here, which is we can't just say we're playing GOAT format. That's not acceptable. If we're playing GOAT format, are we talking about Nationals? Are we talking about SJC Boston, which was the final SJC of the format? A lot of people, when they play GOAT format, at least when it was initially getting popular, like to copy Chris's deck, the one that had Xarian Universe in it. There's a huge debate. I think it's been settled that Xarian should not be included if you're playing GOAT format, because if you're playing Xarian, that means you also should be allowed to play Cyber Dragon. Take a look here at Paul Evidence' deck from the same top 8 where Chris top 8'd. He has a single copy of Cyber Dragon, and if you look at the extra deck, there's Cyber Twin Dragon, which is probably more important, seeing as how Metamorphosis, a Black Luster Soldier, into Cyber Twin is obviously pretty powerful. Well, if we're playing GOAT format, we need to definitively pinpoint when in GOAT format we're playing. So I think for this to work, events need to say, we are playing Nationals 2005. That's it. We can't say we're playing a format, because a format has a lot of different variation. There's the errata issue, there's the ruling issue, there's the card release issue. It's really important that we definitively say we're not just going to play the last day of the format. We have to pinpoint. Like, for example, if you've been familiar with my channel, when I originally talked about DDT, I talked about how there was a small window of time at the end of the September 2006 list before March of 2007 took over, where you could play 3 Stratoses, 3 Defusions. It was just absolutely incredible. DDT at its absolute peak. Well, nobody wants to go and play what they think is going to be SJC Boston with some very limited decks. I mean, the decks at SJC Boston in the fall of 2006 were not very good. And then all of a sudden play against a triple Stratos deck. Well, that's not fun. Unless let's definitively say we're playing the one Shonen Jump that you could play 3 Stratoses. And if you have people in a local area who want to go play mirror matches, then all the power to them. But that needs to be made clear. We can't just play formats. We need to play events. That way, an event like Edison all of a sudden can actually be played. Edison, as those of you who are well aware of from watching my channel or just from your own knowledge of the game, was really a one-off format. After Edison, we have Darksoul released, we have Substitute released, we have Infernity reaching their peak with Launcher at 3. Obviously, if you're going to play Edison, if you end up playing against Herald and Frog FTK, you're not getting the same experience. So if we say we are playing SJC Edison, everyone would know the card pool, they would know the rulings, the erratas, they would know when to research things, what general time frame in terms of determining rulings. It gives us a much better foundation in terms of what to anticipate if you actually went to an event. So those are, to me, really important. One, we need to have the errata settled. We need to make it definitive that erratas are relative to the time period. If an errata occurred like Bazoo or Kaiku that would have affected the format, well, then that takes effect. But we're not jumping to the errata of Chaos Emperor Dragon when we're playing 2003, 2004. In addition to that, we need to be very clear about the rulings that apply today that may not have applied 10 years ago. That needs to be addressed. We need to have very clear and definitive rulings relative to the time period, and it's pivotal in order to accommodate the issues that I just alluded to, that we don't refer to these as formats, but instead as locals that are running a certain event, are running consistent with the rulings and card pool and ban list of a certain event. That way, there's no gray area in terms of what was allowed. The next thing to talk about briefly is, all right, so let's say these things are taken into consideration within reason. Where is this going to go? What do I think is the most likely thing that's going to happen? And if I really got to pull the strings, if they, called me up and said, we like your channel, we want this to work, what do you think would be necessary for this to be super, super successful? I'll talk about that also. Let's start with what I think is most likely to happen. I think the most likely optimal outcome is that they sanction reasonably sized side events at YCSs. Probably Sunday, for those of you who've been eliminated. You can go to a YCS, you can play modern, traditional Yu-Gi-Oh! Day 1, and then Day 2, you can bring your GOAT deck. Let's say Konami had announced ahead of time that not GOAT format, but Nationals 2005 would be the event. You can have your GOAT deck ready to go, and you can play that event. I think that's honestly, unfortunately, the peak of what this is going to be. And I don't even think that that's necessarily something that's going to happen overnight. With COVID and the inability of Konami to run YCSs with regularity, no, we have 2 coming up back-to-back months. We don't really know about March and going forward. Who knows if Nationals is even going to happen with our current outbreak? Who knows when we'll ever get back to running normal events where Konami can experiment with this monthly? Because that, unfortunately, I think is going to be a huge part of this. This is going to require a lot of experimentation on the side of Konami. And without the data to back up the interest, which is what I think YCS side events would allow, this is going to take a long time to even manifest, even with these very limited expectations. But I think, unfortunately, unless this gets way more support than I ever imagined, this is the peak. We'll have sanctioned side events at YCSs. Do I think people will travel for them? Probably not super far, maybe unless you're close. But nevertheless, that's better than what we have now. I think you'll be able to play at your local scene, probably the formats that are more popular, and be able to win OTS packs. I think that's a very reasonable expectation. I think that, honestly, if we look at the YCS side events as the absolute most likely optimal scenario, number 2 is probably just generically the most likely scenario. It's obviously not the most optimal, but if I were to put my money on it, this number 2 might ultimately be what ends up happening. If in your local scene, people are bored with the current format, you have 8 people at least that are willing to play an old format, probably a format like GOAT, probably a format like Edison. Those established popular formats will probably have tournaments that fire. At least you can get OTS packs. I mean, it's better than nothing. It's sort of the reality, though, that I think that this is quite limited unless it gets a lot of support. And in the upcoming final slide, that's where I'm really going to talk about, all right, let's say Konami was legit. We want a secondary format. We look at a game like Magic the Gathering that has, let's talk about this, right? They've got standard, they've got limited, which in and of itself can break down into sealed and draft and then draft that has a sealed top 8, or rather vice versa, sealed that has a draft top 8. You have Historic, you have Pioneer, you have a online only format now, basically, with what Historic is. You have, Alchemy, which sort of fits in there. I mean, you have Legacy, Vintage, you have just a ton. You have just tabletop Magic, quite frankly, where people don't necessarily have any type of ban list that they're following or limitation list. Commander. I mean, I could just keep going on about the variety of different formats that they have in Magic, and they're supported. You can go and play a legit tournament, a Pro Tour level or just high level tournament in a variety of different formats. And you as a player kind of need to have that ability to flex between good limited, which is booster pack opening, whether that's sealed or draft, but also sort of standard, which is the most recent sets, but sometimes even going back 5 to 10 years and playing cards that are much older in historic sets. So that has been a skill that you've needed to really succeed at the high levels of Magic for many, many years now, decades. Could we ever get to that point in Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, this is what we would need for that. Unlike Magic, the changes in Yu-Gi-Oh, I think, are pretty dramatic in terms of rulings. And instead of going back and actually replicating an old format, because of the way the card pool works in Magic with rotation of sets, they simply just play with the current rulings, the current expectations, and they allow more sets to be legal. So it's a very different apparatus by which older formats are approached. It basically just means you get to play older cards that have rotated out. We, in the world of Yu-Gi-Oh, we can still play Harpy's Feather Duster and Imperial Order, unfortunately, at least at the recording of this video, which means what we want is to actually play an old format. In order to really, really do that, I think Konami needs to establish a formal database of card rulings, erratas, and legality. And they need to be very clear about that. And I also think they should limit themselves a little bit. For example, do we really need a card database and ruling for every single SJC that took place in 2005? Not really. Let's pick a pretty reasonable and logical point during GOAT format and say, if you want to play the 2005 summer format, let's play Nationals. Let's play a event that by and large reflects what that format was all about, whether that's asking people who played. Konami, you could ask me and I would happily tell you what event I think represents each format. But I think that would probably be the reasonable thing to do, and then just develop a card pool for that particular event, a card pool with erratas, with legalities, and with the common anticipated rulings. I don't expect every single ruling of every niche card to be applied, right? I think judges at these local events, or even higher, should have the latitude to kind of reasonably piece together what the rulings should be. But the very common in card interactions, like how Mind Crush works, for example, that type of stuff needs to be laid out ahead of time, right? These are already explored formats. And if we find a new card that wasn't used back in 2008 that we actually do kind of need to understand in more context how it would have been ruled, well, we can add to this, right? This needs to be something that evolves over time. But I think you absolutely need to establish a definitive database or a definitive set of expectations when we're looking at these events. And maybe in some formats, you can pick more than one event. Like, for example, if you did want to play the summer Edison format, there should be one for Edison, and then there can be one for Nationals. You want to go play Frog FTK and Herald Lock, and you want to play the original X-Saber and Infernity match, sure, you should be able to have both. I think that might be a format that warrants two separate events that you can simulate. You can either go back and play Edison from the beginning of the format, or you can play Nationals. I honestly think basically every National should just be a default, and then a reasonable event in the wintertime / the fall should also be picked. That would honestly be what I look for, but that is absolutely essential. That way, when you go and say, let's play SJC Boston 06, someone will know what to look for, right? The tournament that you're going to, the local tournament, can say, next Thursday is SJC Boston 06. There will be a database. You can click on their website, theoretically, or wherever this database would exist, and you'll see what the ban list was, the extent of the card pool, and common cards that are used in a lot of the decks, and some of the rulings and erratas that would affect it. I think that's really important. The next thing, let's just say that database exists. Let's say Konami actually truly backed this. Could there ever be an alternative format YCS? Well, technically back in the day, Konami tried limited, basically sealed YCSs, where at least into the top, you would eventually play Modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, but for the majority of the Swish rounds, you would actually play sealed. You would open up packs at the beginning of the day, and you would build a deck out of it, and you would play, and it was real YCS. The champion had the title of a YCS champion. Technically, they actually had to play a modern deck in the top cut, but let's put that aside. Let's just say they actually went the whole event by playing sealed. That's a real YCS. The word YCS has prestige to it. I think there is a universe where they could get to the point where if the interest is clearly there, and this would have to start by having players show up at side events, by having players really push their locals for these. I mean, it needs to be clear that there's interest here. This can't just be, 100 people in a small Discord community who really push for this. That's sort of already the realm that this idea of retro Yu-Gi-Oh exists. If there was really a concerted effort, whether that's by content creators, whether that's just by the masses of people, for there to be a fully supported alternative format, I think there is at least the possibility. One idea that I had, and again, I'm not in the inner workings of Konami. My favorite YCS of the year used to be the one at Gen Con. It's in Indianapolis. It was over the course of a 4-day convention in Indianapolis, Gen Con, the best 4 days in gaming, as they would call it. And it was a really fun event because for Thursday, Friday, you would have a lot of side events, some really awesome side events. There were some really memorable side events back in, I think it was 2011. They did this one side event where you got to play under one of 3 different ban lists. So every person in the tournament had a unique ban list. Basically, one was a traditional list where you got to play Pot of Greed and Chaos Emperor Dragon, but you had very small card pool. You ended up having to run cards like Dunamis Dark Witch just to fill out your light count. Then you got to play sort of the middle ages of Yu-Gi-Oh, where you got to play 3 Stratoses and 3 Bestiaries when they weren't actually at that in modern Yu-Gi-Oh. And then you got to play something that was more reminiscent of modern Yu-Gi-Oh. And you had 3 different simultaneous ban lists competing against each other. That's an awesome side event. You never get to see something like that. But so then Thursday and Friday, you had these awesome side events, and then you had an actual YCS. Well, the problem for Konami is that to actually walk into the convention, you need to pay basically $100. And as a result, the attendance at these events were pretty low, right? You had to commit 4 days. You could just show up for Saturday and Sunday, but to really get the full experience, you want to be there for multiple days. So you kind of have to take days off of work, a lot of travel, a lot of people competing for hotels in the area. And there was a $100 entry, not even just to get into the tournament, but to walk in the door. So you're looking at $120, $125 to play Yu-Gi-Oh, not accounting for other expenses. That was pretty impactful. You would end up having attendance in the hundreds, not the thousands. I think honestly, though, if retro players knew that there was going to be a YCS with that title, with a prize, with the same prize cards, with the same trophy, everything, so that everyone in the country, everyone in the world, quite frankly, knew that if they had been playing in grinding goat format for the past 5-6 years that its popularity has spiked, that if they feel like they really enjoy it, maybe they are like me, someone who played years ago, who loves traveling and loves to see some of their old friends. If they knew that it was going to be a Gen Con, they'd fork over the $100. I would fork over happily a $100 to go to Gen Con, 1, because it's just enjoyable in the first place, but 2, to play a retro YCS there. I think you might actually get more people to show up to a YCS at Gen Con under a retro format than you would under modern Yu-Gi-Oh rules. I think it's very reasonable. If everyone knew, like, this is the one time all year, it's in the summer, relatively speaking, right? The middle of August is when Gen Con typically is. That's for me right before school starts. So that would be kind of perfect. But August, middle August, people know ahead of time that this is my one chance a year to see all my old friends who played throughout my entire Yu-Gi-Oh career. This is the opportunity. I think that could work. I think that's pie in the sky. I don't think this is actually going to happen. But if they really, truly wanted to support this, and it was clear that there was support from the player base, this is what I think would be a reasonable one. I don't think it would make sense to do a event in Philadelphia. You book the Philadelphia Convention Center and you could just have a natural YCS with 1,800 players. Why are you going to have a retro YCS and risk the possibility that you have 500 players, right? That's just not economically sound from their perspective. So I think it would have to have this really unique opportunity for a YCS to occur, but in a condition like something like Gen Con. And they haven't had events at Gen Con, to my knowledge, in a while. I tried to go back and look at their site. I see some from 2014, 2013. So they used to have extravaganzas. They stopped holding YCSs. They used to have extravaganzas. I don't know how long it's been since they've been at Gen Con and if they've just totally abandoned that idea because of the attendance, but I'm just thinking out loud. I would love to see even just one a year. One a year would make all of this so worth it. So worth it. Because then you could have local tournaments that hold, not cash tournaments, but, bigger case tournaments, for example. And you might actually have people that travel a little bit, all gearing up for that one event of the year. It would almost be like the world championship of that retro format, which then brings up how I think that would work, why I think there needs to be a slight tweak in how they would do that. There's only one YCS. They have a few different options. One is to make it multiple format, which would be kind of cool. Like rounds 1 through 3 is 2006. Rounds 4 through 6 is a different format. That's one possibility. A little confusing because you need to show up with a lot of decks. That's a lot of deck lists for the judges to check. So I don't think that that's practical, even though that's how Magic does some of their events. One thing that I think they could do is focus on a specific format. Now, what that would mean is at the side events of YCSs, at the side events of maybe even regionals, at the side events of sanctioned Konami events, there is a specific format that has been dedicated 6 months, or let's just say the duration of a ban list. It can really be either. That way you can focus on, let's say, Edison format, because you know Konami is going to hold only Edison side events for a period of time. And then after that period of time is over, now we can open up a GOAT format. Now we can open up a Troop Dupe format. And we can rotate through a series of formats and make it so that we basically get to go back through the annals of Yu-Gi-Oh history and know what format is being the focus. Now, I think locals should be able to run whatever they feel is necessary, whatever is popular in the area. You know, you don't want to force something on people if they don't have any interest in it. If you have 25 people showing up Wednesday nights to play GOAT format, well, then keep doing it. There's no reason to jump to Troop Dupe if people don't have the cards or the familiarity. But what might be interesting is if all of a sudden we devote 6 months to Troop Dupe, and content creators are streaming it, content creators are talking about it, you're hearing about people that, you have card troopers for trade, I need ultimate machine dupes, oh man, I want some super dust shoots. I think that will garner the interest. And now all of a sudden, if your local's like, yeah, you know what, everybody wants to play Troop Dupe, let's give it a shot, you could actually start to incorporate some of the other formats that aren't as well known into the vernacular of players who didn't necessarily play back then. They'll know what Troop Dupe means. And that way, when you show up to these events, whether it's the side events of a YCS or a regional, you actually have this anticipated expectation of, okay, we're going to play Troop Dupe. I've been practicing Troop Dupe. I've been going back through the decks. I've been trying to recreate things. You know, every retro format is going to undergo what GOAT format has, which is a huge change, taking modern Yu-Gi-Oh perspectives and applying it to the old school. If we do it this way, then we can actually say, you know, let's practice Troop Dupe for a month because I want to do well at the side event. Or, pie in the sky, let's practice Troop Dupe for 5 months because the one YCS of the year, they've told us ahead of time, is Troop Dupe. And we need to go back and brush off our card troopers and machine duplication, cyber phoenixes, and everything else in between, because that's the one chance all year to not only play retro Yu-Gi-Oh, but to play retro Yu-Gi-Oh with the prestige. Because there's one thing about winning a case tournament, right? You go to a case tournament, a lot of OTSs have been running a ton of really exciting case tournaments. And don't get me wrong, it's really cool to win great prizes, but I would forego all of the prizes. I would give up the prize cards. I would give up everything just to have the title. The title is by far the biggest reason to play Yu-Gi-Oh! It is a very intrinsically motivating game, in my opinion. I could care less about the prize cards or anything else in between. The ability to say that you were a champion, that's it. And if we actually attach the word YCS to any of these retro events, that's really me what's going to be the driving force. I mean, you might feel like you're so good at older formats that you can grind and win and get OTS packs and cases, and that's fine. That's great. You throw that word champion at the end of it, YCS champion or retro Yu-Gi-Oh champion, whatever allows it to be prestigious, that's really what I hope for. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you got through the entirety of it, please comment down below any thoughts that you have. I mean, I've only spent a couple hours thinking about this. There's probably a ton of things I didn't even realize or consider. Maybe we could talk about reprint sets. We could talk about putting more cards into OTS packs. I know they've done that with Gatlin Dragon relatively recently. Obviously, that was a concession to GOAT format. So we could talk about other things that need to be taken into consideration, but I think these are really the big ones. But thank you for watching. That's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! Content, and hopefully this Time Wizard content as well.